Welcome to a series of podcasts brought to you by Yale University. Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale, Harold Bloom, analyzes Wallace Stevens's Poems of Our Climate.
I have put together an anthology which you will find, I thought that at the most there might be perhaps 25 to 30 people here, and perhaps there will be anyway. There are also copies of the book I noticed the other day at the so-called Yale bookstore, the Barnes & Nobles at Yale. But most of the copies of this book are over at Labyrinth, which is, as you know, on York Street. It was the only text that we will use because I selected it myself, pretty much with the view of a class rather like this, perhaps this very class. It has 700 pages of very good poetry, from Chaucer to Hart Crane. I avoided all sorts of problems, including my dissension from so much of what is now hailed as ontologically necessary and splendid, by saying no poet was to be admitted who was born in the 20th century itself, and yes, and probably my favorite American poet anyway ever, even counting Walt Whitman and Wallace Stevens and Emily Dickinson, was Hart Crane, and he was born in 1899 and alas killed himself in 1932. So he will mark one end point of us, and we will wander back and forth each week, and it will seem to you at times, I'm quite sure, almost without design, but that's all right also. Any case, we are here to read poems together. The assignment for those of you who will be in the class, whether on a credit or an audit basis, is on the blackboard. It is to read those poems by Stevens, which culminate, if I remember properly, in his death poems. A couple of them are there, but his magnificent 10-canto or section, very beautiful and difficult poem, The Auroras of Autumn, on which we probably will center a week from today, and then we will move on from Stevens elsewhere. Here, in any case, is a poem written by Wallace Stevens, whom I regret to say I met only once. I was very moved by the one time I met him, since he was not only very good-natured, and I was a very raw youth of 19 who had come down from Cornell and sneaked into a meeting of the Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences to hear him read what proved to be the shorter version of the poem eventually to be called An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. And afterwards, someone who eventually became my colleague, now long gone, alas, a very splendid person named Norman Holmes Pearson, seeing me, a forlorn and tattered young man standing at the outer edge and gawking at this luminary who stood all by himself. He was a formidable-looking fellow. Mary McCarthy, years later, having known him in his village days, once said to me, "Do you know what he's really like, Harold?" I said, "I would rather not know." She said, "Every time I was in a party in the old days and my back was turned to the door, and I suddenly felt that the temperature in the room had gone down 25 degrees as though a deep freeze unit had been introduced. She said, I knew Wally was there, and I turned around, and there indeed he was. He was a formidable presence, I think he was. Beneath the crustiness and the shyness, in the end, a very amiable person, as he proved on that occasion. I was brought up to him by Norman Pearson and introduced, gazed upon him in some shock and awe, to use that grand phrase which has, like so many things, been ruined permanently by our, never mind. I must stick to what I should stick to. And he kindly asked me why I was interested in him, and I explained that I had always been madly in love with his poetry, and we talked a little about his poetry that he didn't much want to. He said, "You're going to be a graduate student?" I said, "Yes, I'll probably come here." He said, "What will you write on?" I said, "I would like to write a dissertation on Shelley," which became my first book. And he astonished me. I knew from reading his poetry that he knew and liked Shelley, because he referred to Shelley by name. But out of nowhere he suddenly quoted an extraordinary stanza from Shelley's very visionary poem called The Witch of Atlas. The stanza begins, "Men scarcely know how beautiful fire is." And that in fact is the most intense memory I remember of that encounter, but no more of that. Here is a poem that he wrote in 1938 when he was 59 years old. It was first published in a middle period volume of his poetry. We'll talk more about his different phases a week from today, called Parts of a World. I still remember, after so many years, the first time I read this, when it instantly found its way to my heart and mind. And look, just to put it on the table and warning you that I don't regard myself, particularly if I'm deeply in love with something that I'm quoting, I don't regard myself as someone who can read aloud well. Many of you, I'm sure, could do better, but it's important sometimes just to put the poem on the table, as it were. So here is, and the title always matters in a Stevens poem, though we will come back to it at the end, "The Poems of Our Climate," quite possibly, of course, playing upon clime, which means place, and climate. Clear water in a brilliant bowl, pink and white carnations. The light, and notice the pause, because enjambments are very important in Stevens, and particularly in this poem. The light in the room, more like a snowy air, reflecting snow, a newly fallen snow, at the end of winter when afternoons return, pink and white carnations. One desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified, a ball of white, cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. Notice, by the way, that this is a poem in 3 sections rather than 3 stanzas. They're not quite consecutive, and by marking them off with Roman numerals, he means to indicate that. So he starts again. Say even that this complete simplicity, stripped one of all one's torments, concealed the evilly compounded vital I, and made it fresh in a world of white, a world of clear water, brilliant edged. Still one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy scents. There would still remain the never-resting mind, so that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. We have time, and I want us to take this very slowly indeed. Not just word by word and phrase by phrase, though we will do that, but enjambment by enjambment. And, the kind of total human perspective that it keeps involving us in. But then, first the simplest question, with the warning that when you ask yourself, when I ask you, when you ask me, when I ask myself, what is a particular poem, or for that matter, any body of writing or any work of art about, we know what we mean by that. We're used to communicating in that way. But the etymological meaning of about, which I never let myself forget, and I urge you not to forget, means to be on the outside of something, out and about, as it were. So to say that, or to ask what the subject of this poem, as it were, or the thematic of this poem, or what this poem is about, is already to have taken up necessarily what I would call some kind of a metaphorical or tropological stance in relation to it. But we have no other way, I think, in the end, of talking about imaginative literature except to take up, I hope knowingly, it's always better to do it knowingly, one kind of metaphoric or figurative stance or another. I still remember how many years, and it's a long time ago now, because, and I don't like remembering this because he was very dear to me and he died of a lingering illness, but the late Paul DeMont and I used to walk around New Haven together, invariably arguing exactly the same point. He would insist that the privileged trope or figuration, which always had to be taken up in relation to any poem or literary work of art, anything written in language, had to be irony. And I would say no. It's just one trope among other tropes, and it's rather like my saying with Whitman, one should take up the stance of synecdoche, the substitution of the whole for the part, or of the part for the whole, or take up, for that matter, the stance of a metalepsis, which is a, technically speaking, and it always drives people crazy when you say this, a metonymy of a metonymy, which sounds silly, and I'll try to keep out of such 17th century, now archaic technicalities. And he would always shake his head, because we were very fond of one another, though he thought I was not quite sane. And he would put his hand on the back of my neck like that, and he would always say the same thing in his odd Belgian accent. He would say, and this was daily, "The trouble with you, Harold, is you do not believe in the truth." That meant truth. And that meant indeed that I would not accept the German metaphysical romantic rhetorician Friedrich Schlegel's definition of all literature as partaking of irony, and therefore of what Schlegel and the man after him called a permanent parabasis of meaning, that is to say, a permanent wandering of meaning. So, what is this poem about? That's a long digression, but you will discover soon enough, and it will make many of you vote with your feet, which might on the whole be best, since we are a few too many at the moment. I don't mean to be mean in any way. Mean to be mean is an odd circumlocution. What is this poem about? In the ordinary or ostensible sense. I mean, through many years of meditating upon it, and I must admit, not playing fair, a very close late friend whom I mourn still, about 15 or 20 years after alcoholism put her early away, was Stevens's one child, his daughter Holly. And Holly would always tell me that her father's perpetual ritual, as he would come home from his long working day, where he was the vice president in charge of all legal matters, meaning lawsuits, obviously, for what was then the Hartford General Indemnity and Life Insurance Company, and I believe the second largest life insurance company in Hartford. Hartford is much less the insurance capital of the United States than it was back in Stevens's day, or even in my day. Part of the general business decline of the state of Connecticut, I suppose. But his ritual, and he lived in splendid solitude, Holly always being away with his wife, Elsie. Holly says that in her entire life, not once was anyone ever invited for dinner or to drop by for a drink. Stevens was an intensely solitary. He would come home, since he lived high, there would be a daily order with a leading flower shop in Hartford, and he would have specified a particular kind of flower, and waiting for him on a table in his study would be these freshly cut flowers, and being, one finds among his books many volumes on the art of Japanese flower arrangement, something rather less fashionable in these not-so-Zen days than it used to be even in my day. And he would make some kind of Japanese arrangement of the flowers, and then he would sit there and have a couple of martinis and look at the latest things that had reached him from Paris, or read aloud to himself poems by Paul Valery, whom he greatly revered. So, sort of give the game away pretty obviously, but it's not saying much. It is a poem about making a flower arrangement of a particular kind and the consequences of having made that arrangement. But the poem is not called The Flower Arrangements of Our Climate. It's called The Poems of Our Climate. And at this point there will be other voices, I trust, than just my own, of which after 76 years I am justly a little tired of, as anybody would be. What seems redundant about the opening line of the poem? Clear water in a brilliant bowl. One understands, though we'll talk about it in a moment, that you're using a brilliant bowl, that is to say, a bowl that seems to emit, E-M-I-T, light, rather than one that merely reflects light. But whoever would make a flower arrangement in murky water or unclean water? What then should one do with the fact that this poem begins with clear water? Stevens, though he did not like to be told this, I remember that one meeting telling him this, and it came up again in a sort of indirect conversation through Holly later on. He didn't like it at all. He hated the idea of influence. He disliked the word, he disliked the concept. He, any time a literary symposium could get through to him and ask his opinion of Walt Whitman in particular, he would say, if you pardon my saying so, and of his ghost, which I sometimes fear since Hartford is not that far away and I met him in this city, might hover near and disapprove of me. And at my age, I begin to feel spooked out by the idea of ghosts. He's an intensely allusive poet. And one of the poets, perhaps more often than any other poet to whom he finds himself alluding, is Whitman. And indeed the very title here, I think, is a Whitmanian kind of an allusion. But if you encounter something in a poem clearly of extraordinary art and artifice, as this is, a poem clearly of elaborate subtlety, and you encounter the improbability of clear water when you are, look, this is what you want for your flower arrangement. You want a brilliant ball. You want pink and white carnations, of which more in a moment. I should add that my own wife of 50 years has never liked this poem because she loathes carnations. And the one time that I ever tried to bring her carnations in honor of this poem, she said, "Take them out of my house." So I haven't tried it again since. In particular, I suppose the combination of pink and white carnations in these post-feminist days of ours, and I do not say that contentiously. Wallace Stevens was a man very much of the old school, born in 1879 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in an extremely right-wing family of an old-line business sort of orientation. In many ways, many of his social ideas would not be shared by more than, at most, I would hope, 2 or 3 people who are here in the room with me. I would not be one of those 2 or 3 people. Clear water, one realizes, has to be metaphorical or in some sense figurative. Why? It doesn't make sense otherwise. The first thing to look for, if something doesn't make sense, if something seems not to suit the context, is the whole question of allusion. Where would you find allusions to clear water in literature, in poetry? There's a poem, which actually Stevens knew, though I didn't realize this for years. I must have published 5 or 6 separate readings of this poem, The Poems of Our Climate, through the years, none of which probably ever agreed with one another, since I never discussed it twice, and I've been discussing it hundreds of times throughout the last 55 years. there's a poem by Rimbaud about his adolescence and taking communion for the first time, which begins with, in any accurate English translation of it, the phrase clear water. Whether or not there is some hidden allusion or echo there, I don't know. I think on some level, I will not say in Stevens's mind, but we still do not know here in 2006 what it is in our brains that allows one to manifest an unusual facility or power of figuration. Though it always haunts me that Aristotle himself says that the difference between what he calls literary genius and just literary talent is the question of the ability to quite triumphantly create metaphor. Excuse me. Many of you must know Blake's introduction to the first poem in what becomes the composite volume, The Songs of Innocence and of Experience, and begins with a poem, a kind of induction to the Songs of Innocence, sometimes miscalled in anthologies The Piper, which begins piping down the valley wild piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, typical Blakean opening, and with his voice he said to me, pipe a song about a lamb, and so on and so forth. But towards the end of it, clearly speaking in the first person, Blake says, and remember he was an engraver by profession and also by proclivity, if he engraved one of his poems, whether short or long, it meant that he wanted it to be preserved. If he did not engrave it, even though that is a dark rule to use in regard to him, because it would exclude what in some ways I think is his masterpiece, that large manuscript called the Four Zoas, Z-O-A-S, which we have in a manuscript with many sketches on it, which clearly would have been illuminations for the engraving of it. But he was uneasy with it, and he never did engrave it. It gives one a kind of puzzle if any of you ever become strongly interested in studying Blake. And I myself, when young, was a ferocious Blakean. I have not been that now for perhaps half a century. But I see that my youthful commentary on Blake survives in my late friend David Erdman's standard edition of the Poetry and Prose of Blake, wherein back in very small print is a commentary of almost Talmudic intensity by me on the poems. The oddity of Blake, and we're getting a long way afield from Stevens, or perhaps not, is that you can't really understand the brilliant engraved epics, Milton and Jerusalem, without reference to the mythology set forth in the Four Zoas, and yet the Four Zoas is technically a rejected work. In any case, he ends this poem, which is not the first of his engraved poems, but he wants it to be the first in his personal canon, as it were. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear. How should one read, and I stained the water clear? He had invented his own process for engraving and coloring his engraving. Unlike anyone else in his time, he would use acid to sort of burn away the surfaces that he did not want, so that only the illumination stood out. And I suppose that for him was a metaphor also of what it was that he was trying to do as an artist in that composite form. And I stained the water clear. Stained, of course, means many colors, but it also means what? If we speak of staining the clear water, what other meaning can it easily have? Yes, blemishing it, making it in some way other than clean and clear. Curious that Shelley, who never read Blake's poetry, though there were some biographical connections, between them, Blake had been very close to Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft, whom Shelley never met but worshipped, had been the mother of Shelley's second and permanent wife, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, whose full name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, but Mary Wollstonecraft, alas, died in childbirth, in giving birth to the lady who eventually became the second and final Mrs. Shelley. And perhaps the most famous use of that particular trope or metaphor in the English language in the astonishing lament in Spenserian stanzas for the death of John Keats. Shelley writes, "Life like a dome of many colored glass stains the white radiance of eternity." And since he knew Shelley so well, and on the whole liked him a little better than he liked Blake, Stevens may have an allusion to that also. Interesting. Well, I don't want to go off on too many tangents. I have a horrible tendency towards digressiveness, and I'm still mostly answering my own questions. A poem then on the art of Japanese flower arrangement. Anybody here ever read a manual on Japanese flower arrangement, or are there people here particularly interested in flower arrangements? It wouldn't normally be my reading at all, though. At my age, I'm likely to have read anything. But I read all the ones that Stevens had owned because I was so fascinated by this poem. They tend to emphasize achieving effects, E-F-F-E-C-T-S, out of all proportion to the actual means that are being employed. That is to say, an art of what most of us here would now call minimalism, though they never use the term, which would be the Japanese equivalent of minimalism. And Stevens has set out, and I think I finally dug out of one of these manuals, the very one he had in mind, how, even though it is not seasonal, not in winter, but in quite another season of the year, though it isn't specified what season, how with just a few flowers and a light-emitting bowl and water, how you can achieve an effect of enormous dearth or emptiness. And in some sense, that seems to be what Stevens had in mind with his flower arrangement. To use his own vocabulary, which we won't get into until a week from today, stripping down to the first idea, reducing things so as to avoid the pathetic fallacy. It's most famous, of course, in the little poem, The Snowman, which is one of the poems I'm asking you to read for a week from today. The pathetic fallacy is not actually a fallacy. Stevens encountered it where anyone can and should encounter it, in the pages of Ruskin. I think it's in the Stones of Venice rather than modern painters. It is, as Ruskin says, the imputation of life to the object world, to the natural world, the imputation of human consciousness to the natural world. And yet, as with everything else of Ruskin, or for that matter Stevens, it's a deeply contradictory thing to call it a pathetic fallacy, because a few pages further on, Ruskin actually defines a poet as a woman or a man to whom things speak. And if things speak, then clearly you have a kind of pathos, which after all has to do with human feeling, which is involved. In any case, not to spend longer on the opening, this is the effect that you're trying to achieve. And I repeat, the manual itself would tell you this, but the poem itself, if you read it closely, will tell you this. Stevens, in fact, writes this poem on a day in very early autumn, insofar as I could work out the date. It must have been just about now, in terms of the number. What is today? September the 7th. Could well have been September the 7th, 1938. But he wants a wintry scene. He wants the effect of a wintry scene in the room to be achieved by these very minimal but very deft means. But what kind of a wintry scene does he want? The lights in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow. By the way, before one even tries to answer that question, why is this poem so obsessed with the word more? Thus, in the first stanza, it occurs there, the light in the room more like a snowy air. A few lines further down, pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. And the last line of the section, with nothing more than the carnations there. Then it returns 3 times in the last 2 lines of the second section. Still, one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy scents. And then he, for reasons that I think are deeply embedded in what is going on in the poem, it is too late to still use that particular kind of a word. But for 2 sections, the word more beats almost like a kind of the curse of existence now, our cell phones. I'm sorry. What kind of effect is he trying to achieve by his flower arrangement? The light, and notice again the enjambment. Well, all that enjambment means is that you sow. He's a great master of syntax, Stevens. In fact, though this sort of jumps well ahead of the gun in many ways, 2 things in Stevens have always fascinated me stylistically. One is that he uses words which are really in opposition, that's with an O, and you will see him doing it several times vitally in this poem, and puts them in apposition, as though they reinforce one another or are saying the same thing, when in fact they contradict one another. The other, which is very curious indeed, is that he tends to negate by grammar, but then affirm by syntax. I know that will seem to make very little sense at first and will seem cold and rather technical, but the consequences of it, even in this poem and the rest of his poetry, are very considerable. In any case, what effect are you trying to achieve? Following the manuals, in fact. The lights. I know, I got into this by talking about syntax. Enjambment is not an effect of grammar at all, but purely of syntax. It has to do with not the relation so much of the words to one another as grammar would. It isn't so much a question of diction, as it were. It is a question of disposal or arrangement. The lights, and if you enjam, then you come down upon the word, and frequently I think you're left a little baffled. Why emphasize it? The lights, clearly that means everything in the effect you're trying to achieve. In the room, more like a snowy air reflecting snow. What's wrong with that first time you come to the phrase more like? What makes it a little peculiar or difficult? Please don't go on standing. You'll get so tired if you stay. I mean, find some way of sitting. Or whatever. I'm sorry, dears. What's odd about that first use of more? More like, what, dear?
There's no point of comparison.
It's actually, and I've discovered this in trying to teach Stevens abroad. If you teach Stevens in English to people whose normal way of handling language is in Spanish or Portuguese or Italian or whatever, they don't have any trouble with Stevens' language. But the British have never gotten used to him, and they still don't much like him, and that's because he really does write the American idiom rather than a British idiom of some kind. He really is a much more Whitmanian poet than he perhaps was comfortable in realizing. At one point in Huckleberry Finn was a great repository of American verbal style in the 19th century and immensely influential upon us now. At one point in it, someone is asking Huck to explain what something had been like, and he shrugs and says, well, you know, more like. And I think everyone in this room probably apprehends what Huck means, yet it would be very difficult, I think, to find a discursive way of saying that at this point, and this is simply my personal madness and my endless tendency towards digressiveness. I suddenly remember my favorite moment in Huckleberry Finn when Aunt Polly, who's a very good woman, finds Huck in a whooping and utterly unnecessary lie. And I commend this to you because it's very useful indeed. And she says, Huck, why do you lie even when you can't gain any possible benefit from it? And he hangs his head and he shifts from one foot to another and he says quite wonderfully, ma'am, merely to keep in practice. This is a very, very American kind of a moment. Let us get back to this, and I will try to stop being digressive. Why do you think, aside from the Americanism of it, he adopts the light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow, and then adds a newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return? That line, what is it, the fifth line of the poem, has haunted me all my life, particularly having lived so much of it now in southern New England. You know how when, and it happens in other parts of the country too, of course, what after all would that mean at the end of winter when afternoons return? You suddenly realize one day that suddenly you've got afternoons, when for a long time you didn't have afternoons, when you seemed to pass from, say, an hour or two after midday to twilight, so quickly, almost like a breath. And suddenly you have prolonged afternoons again. It doesn't get dark till 8 or 9 or whatever, aside from the intricacies of daylight saving. At the end of winter when afternoons return. But when you put something like that, you're talking about something happening without your being at first immediately aware of them. And that must have something to do with the effect that the flower arrangement is meant to have. The light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow, a newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. When in the seasonal cycle, which itself has nothing to do with the moment in which the poem is written, thank you, dear, where in the seasonal cycle are you trying to put the peculiar kind of light, the peculiar rays of light you're trying to bring about by your flower arrangement in this poem? It clearly is not that moment where, in a late bleak poem, Stevens writes, it is deep January, the sky is hard, bad is final in this light. No, it isn't that at all. At the end of winter, when afternoons return. So you've got a kind of snowman's vision, a winter vision, that you're trying to bring about in the light in the room, but it's on the upgrade. It isn't the nadir, it isn't the low point of the year. A newly fallen snow at the end of winter, when afternoons return. What would it mean to say, and I promise to leave this and go on to other things, that the effect you're trying to achieve, which is, notice, a purely visual effect, and obviously there's an extraordinary leap or gap between having a brilliant bowl in which you have placed pink and white carnations in water and the effect you are achieving. In fact, the effect you're achieving, as one discovers deep in the second section, but it's there already in the great bitterness of the close of the first, is far beyond anything you could have intended. And since in this poem the flower arrangement is a synecdoche, a part standing for a whole, of Stevens's characteristic life and his characteristic way of writing poems and the poems themselves, then the kind of bleakness that is being suggested is a very considerable sort of bleakness indeed, but I won't overwork that at the moment. Go on to the very strange pink and white carnations. One desires, and if you linger in enjambment on the word desires, then clearly desire has a great deal to do with what is going on in the poem. Well, presumably this is mostly repressed desire. One desires so much more than that. By the way, notice that one. If you sit in an office with me, or you come drink tea with me at home, as many of you no doubt will, before the semester is over, and in the course of a conversation, I never use the capital letter I. My wife complains about this sometimes. And I think I picked this up from a lifetime of reading Stevens's poetry. If you get into a conversation with anyone, and she or he is always saying, well, one reflects that such and such is the case, one always thinks, the impersonal one, I at least grow uneasy when someone is doing that with me, and I guess I cause uneasiness. And it seems abstract. It seems like an attempt to avoid the personal. It's almost at the opposite extreme from speaking of oneself in the third person. I'm 76 years old, and I've only known one person who invariably spoke of himself in the third person. I was a great friend and follower and devotee of the late great Kabbalistic scholar, the father of modern Kabbalistic scholarship, the late Gershom Scholem. And whether I visited him in reverence in Jerusalem, as I frequently did, or he was here getting an honorary degree, which I brought about, or I was introducing him at lectures in New York or Boston, and spent time with him or had dinner with him, I was always struck by the fact that he always spoke of himself in the third person. I've never heard anyone else ever do that. His typical sentence was, the opinion of such and such on this is as follows, but Scholem always says, and then he would lay down the law and tell me what Scholem always said. After a while, I got used to it, but it was initially a little disconcerting. And as I say, you had to be Scholem to, eccentric as I may be, I will never, I hope, start saying such and such says such and such, but Bloom always says, and so on. That would be an act of madness. One would have crossed the line. Though Scholem was in his way a very tough-minded kind of a rationalist, very odd for a lifelong scholar of an extremely esoteric, quasi-mystical perhaps, or visionary discipline like Kabbalah. Pink and white carnations. Why are carnations called carnations? It started in medieval Italy, as many of you probably know, and as the name would indicate, think of incarnations. Carnation suggests what about this particular flower? I mean, the use of the word carnation. It was somehow felt, and people still feel this, because if you ask them about this, they think about it while they say, yes, there seems to be something flesh-like about the texture of a carnation. Perhaps that's why my wife does not like them. And of course, since we are dealing with a gentleman of the masculine persuasion, very masculine indeed, born in Bucks County in 1879, if he has told the store to send pink and white carnations, then the association inevitably, even if this would not be perhaps rightly condemned by that ugly word, sexist, clearly the desires would have to do with the fact that your flower arrangement in some sense reflects some image or longing for female flesh. I don't need to have to blush to say that. It's simply there in the poem. But it becomes more puzzling with one desires, and you linger there in the enjambment, so much more than that. Now, it is the second time we have heard the word more, and the first time was a puzzle. The light in the room more like something than a snowy air. This time, what's the problem with it? Pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. If you were to literalize that, it would be kind of funny or odd, wouldn't it? One thinks of, at least I do, in that marvelous comic opera, Patience, isn't it? Yes, Patience. The wonderful character Bunthorne, who is clearly based upon the divine Oscar Wilde, whom I revere, but whom Gilbert and Sullivan did not like at all. Bunthorne, the aesthete, who sings that great song which goes, if you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line, as a man of culture, you must get up all the German sewing. You must lie among the daisies and discourse in novel phrases of your complicated state of mind. And best of all, then a passion a la Plato. No, then a sentimental passion of a vegetable fashion must excite your languid spleen. A passion a la Plato for a bashful young potato or a not too French bean, though the Philistines may jostle, you will rank as an apostle in the high aesthetic band if you walked on Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in your medieval hand, and so forth. It's a lovely patter song of Gilbert and Sullivan. It is Patience, I'm pretty sure. But I invoke Bunthorne, I invoke Wilde, and I remember it first came into my head that way for an obvious reason. Look, if you or I were writing a play or attending a play, and there was someone on stage staring at a ball of pink and white carnations, and that character were to say, one desires so much more than that, we might want to react by saying, well, one would hope so, surely that cannot be the limit of the, shall we say, sexual aspirations of this particular person. But imagine a play by Wilde, and Wilde's plays meant a good deal to Stevens. Imagine, an exquisite like Algernon in The Importance of Being Earnest, or some of the more interestingly effete young men in one of the other Wilde comedies, like A Woman of No Importance, or Lady Windermere's Fan, or An Ideal Husband. Imagine him on stage pausing in front of a ball of pink and white carnations and murmuring, one desires so much more than that. We would not so much find it funny as we would find it revelatory. But how, or of what? I say, if you gave it that kind of literary placement, well, a very simple way of putting it, what would the word more actually mean? Since this is an emblem of flesh and the female flesh, whether this be ascetic or whether this be a question of another range of sexual orientation, it is rather as though the word more here means less. Why do I say that? Why is that not purely arbitrary on my part? Pink and white carnations. Remember, you have a young man on stage, exquisitely dressed, an Algernon Moncrief or John Worthing or one of these fellows, Lord Waring in An Ideal Husband, all of whom have sort of, you might say, borderline sexual orientation. One desires so much more than that. And I say, well, more there really means less. I guess I'm asking you to interpret what I was saying rather than what the poem is saying. But I think, yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I took it to mean one desires less, and that pink and white carnations are a direct signifier it's a clear signifier of flesh, and maybe something more subtle or something more artistic. We're talking about the art of composing a poem.
Yes, presumably something more ascetic, something more minimalist, something less essentialist, as they would say. Nowadays, something perhaps like that. But then notice what happens. You have, I think, the most severe enjambment in the poem, the day itself. Now, to come down hard upon the word itself is curious. This poem, like most of Stevens, is written indoors. And like me, he was mostly a kind of indoor person. It's very hard, especially these days when I practically live on a treadmill. It's hard for my wife to get me out of the house. He loved Coleridge's Dejection and Ode, and I think he rewrites it in a number of places. And the image I always take away from Dejection and Ode is what I frequently take from Coleridge. You see that large, pallid, rather white face of Coleridge pressed against the window pane, looking out at the peculiar green light that lingers in the west as a storm begins to develop there in Dejection and Ode. Stevens, it is as though he himself is now looking outside, and what is he discovering? The minimalism of what he has sought, the simplification, is no longer just a question of the light in the room. It is now a question of what? The day itself is simplified. A ball of white, cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. Very difficult, I think, not to hear some rhetorical bitterness there. And that cannot just be an imputation on my part. But cognitively speaking, intellectually speaking, what is it that the speaker of the poem has discovered? Well, his flower arrangement, grandly successful, following the manuals, in its indoor effect, seemed to have moved outdoors and to be achieving very much the same effect. And if that at first seems arbitrary on my part, let's follow it out together. The day itself is simplified. Hovering in Stevens's mind, I deeply suspect, or he would never have admitted it, any time he was asked by correspondents or people who knew him a question about Pater, he would say, yes, Walter Pater, his books are up in the attic somewhere. Or if asked a question about Ralph Waldo Emerson, he would say, yes, Emerson, his books are up in the attic somewhere. They weren't in the attic in either case. They were very close by. At hand, he could have reached out his hand. You're going to be reading a poem called The Idea of Order at Key West as one of the poems you read for next time. In the extraordinary climax to the poem, Stevens cries out, Ramon Fernandez, tell me if you know, and goes on from there. And in correspondence, he insisted that he had simply used two ordinary names and that he had meant no reference whatsoever to the still existent Ramon Fernandez, who was a sort of Spanish-born but Parisian neoclassical literary critic whose works had been translated, one with an introduction by Alan Tate, whom Stevens knew, and even as he wrote that letter, he could have reached out his arm and found Ramon Fernandez sitting on his shelf. So he's not to be believed in such matters, but then no great poet is to be believed in such matters. How did I get here? The day itself is simplified. A ball of white. You know, I had written about this poem for years and taught it, much more importantly, for years, before I suddenly realized what that ball of white came from. And that inverted dome of white we call the sky. That's probably from one of the two most famous, that is in fact from what are probably one of the two most famous poems in the English language. One is Gray's Elegy. The other, though you and I don't read it much anymore, though I read it occasionally, it's a very fine poem, Edward Fitzgerald's supposed translation from the Persian of Omar Khayyam, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which still has, a very vast circulation among ordinary people in this country who don't generally read poetry. In it, there is the line, very bitterly spoken by Omar, who is a skeptic, and that inverted dome of white, and that inverted ball, in fact, No, it's literal. And that inverted ball of white we call the sky. I don't know whether this was an indeliberate allusion and therefore an echo, or somehow a deliberate allusion on Stevens's part, but it sets up what follows, which is the most explicit literary allusion, I think, to be found anywhere in Stevens's large body of poetry. Cold, a cold porcelain. That reference we all of us know. And we suddenly see what the model of this poem is, and the poem with which this poem necessarily has to compete. If you are gazing upon a porcelain, and you speak of it as being cold, who writes, "Thou, silent form, doth tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral." That is what poem? You have all read it. It's Keats's ode on a Grecian urn. If you've ever been in what is now called the British, it's now called the British Library, it used to be called the British Museum, but the Portland vase, which is thought to be, and probably was, the Grecian urn that Keats had been staring at in the poem, because it shows the same sort of sequence of scenes that the urn does in the poem. It's made of porcelain, of course, and porcelain is not a brilliant ball, so you are somewhere else than your own flower arrangement. You're up against what is influencing you. And notice that repetition of the word cold. By the way, Stevens is haunted by an association of Keats with cold, or a cold porcelain. There's a wonderful poem, which we won't have time to read, called Extracts from Addresses to the Academy of Fine Ideas, in which a slightly mad lecturer, speaking to the other members of the Academy of Fine Ideas, one wishes there was such an organization, particularly in these peculiar days. I wouldn't mind, even though I have followed lifelong. I always say I am the true Marxist literary critic, meaning Groucho and not Carlo, and take as my motto Groucho's two great statements: I wouldn't be a member of any club that would have me for a member, and even better, whatever it is, I'm against it. Still, if somebody were to establish an Academy of Fine Ideas, one might join it. And I suddenly remember that many years ago, my late friend Roger Shattuck persuaded me to join the International Society of Pataphysics, originally surrounded, there's a Freudian slip, established by the great Jarry, pataphysics being the science of imaginary solutions. But that is another story. I'm just driving us all mad, so just ignore my digressions. Why the reference to Keats, which is unmistakable? The day itself is simplified. That inverted ball of white we call the sky is a reference to Fitzgerald, but Fitzgerald was himself a kind of Keatsian aesthete. He was a pre-Raphaelite, a close friend of Tennyson, a close friend of the Rossettis, a close friend of Swinburne, and they were all Keatsians. Cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. What's your relationship as a reader, which is startlingly like Keats's own relationship as a writer, to the Grecian urn as you go from the beginning of the poem to the very end of it? And this is very much, I think, his poem, The Poems of Our Climate, is the Grecian urn as rewritten or revised by Wallace Stevens. What happens to Keats's relation to the urn and what it depicts, the world upon it, and therefore in some sense to you as the sympathetic reader, as you go from the opening of the poem to the very close of it? Towards the close comes, "Thou silent form doth tease us out of thought, as doth eternity." And then there is bitterness in cold, pastoral. After all, what's odd about saying that what you see upon the urn, which he has described with great vividness, is a cold pastoral. Is it in fact a cold pastoral that the urn depicts, whether it be the porcelain vase or Keats's poem? The crucial thing are nymphs and fauns who are fleeing rather teasingly from satyrs and other Dionysiac beings who are pursuing them, and was clearly a scene of sexual teasing, soon to climax in a kind of general orgy of some sort. That's deeply implied if you stare at it, or if you stare at Keats's poem. Very odd to call that cold pastoral, but perhaps the best definition I've ever heard of where you are or where Keats is in relation to his urn at the end of the poem is by my old crony, the late Walter Jackson Bate, who wrote brilliantly about Keats, and who remarked that in the course of the poem, Keats and the reader become progressively more estranged from what is depicted on the urn, and therefore from the urn itself. Somehow, instead of being friendly towards you, the work of art, be it the poem or the porcelain, becomes unfriendlier, reminds you that you cannot participate in it, reminds you of your own mortality, and Keats already knows that he is a highly tubercular young man and is not in fact going to live more than another couple of years at the most. But why should Stevens bring it in here? The allusion is deliberate in the highest degree. In fact, that porcelain, I broke in on myself in that extract from Addresses to the Academy of Fine Ideas, that sort of mad parodist of a lecturer cries out at one point, "Let the secretary for porcelain observe." And it's pretty clear that in that academy, the secretary for porcelain is John Keats. I remember years later breaking out into laughter when my old friend Sir Frank Kermode, who's a very good literary critic, 10 years older than myself, gallantly fighting cancer at the moment, off there in Cambridge, England, when Sir Frank interpreted the rather strange line initially in An Ordinary Evening in New Haven, which goes, "A porcelain as yet and the bats thereof," as though these bats were actual winged creatures flying about. But of course, what else are bats in the English language and in the American language? Chunks of unbaked clay, which you mold and then bake in order to form porcelain, are called bats. So if you are speaking of a porcelain, again you are speaking of a Grecian urn, as it were, in the or a Keatsian poem, but as yet an unbaked and unput together kind of a condition. So it is for Stevens a recurrent metaphor or trope. It's obsessive, in fact. So for a last time, because I must get us out of the first section, the day itself is simplified. A ball of white, cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. How does the third more differ from the first two? The first is sort of puzzling, more like a comparative without something being compared to. The second is almost comic. One desires so much more than that, because it only makes sense if more in a kind of high aesthetic context means something like less. But the third is rather grim. You combine more with nothing, whether in the vernacular or in metaphysics, and what are you saying? With nothing more than the carnations there. Look, I have made my flower arrangement. I've written my poem so far. I perform my life work up to the age of 59. It's 1938, and he was born in 1879, so he is 59 years old, and he's really entering upon what would be the major phase of his poetry, which will take him down to just short of his 75th birthday, when alas he will go off to the hospital to die of cancer while writing magnificently. What attitude, how far are you from the Keats of the Grecian urn when you invoke Keats here? That is to say, your attitude towards what you are doing There may be a chair. Oh, God, there is a chair. How far are you from the Keats of the Urn? Are you really distanced from him, or are you not in some sense repeating the same experience? Perhaps I'm asking these questions badly. It's quite possible. And we are a large group, and those of you who decide to come back will get used to me, and I will get used to you. There is bitterness in the last, let us say, 4.5 lines of this first section. You have been all too successful. The day outside is like that strange artificial light that in the mind, purely in the mind, you have induced within by your too successful minimalist Japanese flower arrangement. But Keats has entered your mind. And of course, to write a meditation upon a bowl, an urn, a vase, is to enter competition with Keats necessarily. At this point, I have a memory which will add some comic relief and which not necessarily be a pure digression. Many years ago, I was staying at Wadham College, Oxford. At that point, the warden of Wadham, wonderful alliterative name for the master of a college, was the late Sir Maurice Bowra, B-O-W-R-A. He was a very distinguished classicist. And he had just returned from the American Lecture Corps. And I commended an essay I had recently read by him on Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. And as we settled into a large cognac bottle together, he said, yes, he said, I gave that 32 times. I said, Sir Maurice, didn't you get tired of giving the same lecture? He said, no. He said, the fees were properly extravagant. And then he won my heart forever by saying, you know, Bloom, the Grecian urn became a pot of gold for me. But that's just to sort of lighten, it's a truthful story, and it will lighten the particular moment. Move on to the second section. There is something baffled or unhappy. There's too close an affinity, perhaps, with Keats, and it's very dangerous to write a poem in competition with the Ode on a Grecian Urn. It's like trying to write, you know what it makes me think of in a way? In the Trinity College manuscript, which were papers left behind in Trinity College by the young John Milton, is a wonderful, fascinating blank page. All it has on it is a title. It says, Macbeth, a Tragedy by John Milton. And then you get a blank sheet. No more need be said. The poet who was to write Paradise Lost quite wisely decided that he did not enter into that competition. But willy-nilly, this poem has taken on the Ode on a Grecian Urn. The question is, what is to happen? How does the second section, and I know I must speed up a little because I cannot with any decency keep us more than about another 35 minutes, and besides, unless I get more response, being an old man, I will run out of breath. I will drink some water. How does the second section of the poem differ from the first? I mean, in the largest sense. The rhythm of thought changes, and will change again in the third. The third is almost a march movement in the way it speeds up. But the second is curiously bitter in a very odd way. I remember once trying to explain, more than once, to a British or, British, comprehend Scots and Welsh as well as English and North Irish, trying to explain, or some North Irish, trying to explain the opening of the second section, but it's an American idiom, and you can't get it across, the barrier of a common tongue divides us from the Brits forever, which might be just as well, but never mind. I apologize to any British who are in the room. Say even that there's complete simplicity. What does that idiom mean? You and I are walking along together. We're having a little bit of a dispute. Not necessarily a major dispute, but we are arguing some particular point. And suddenly I shrug and say even that. What does that mean already? Yeah, I will sort of accept your premises. If I were to accept your position on this, say even that, I go over to your side on this. Nevertheless, notice what the consequences of this are when you properly think or argue them through. Say even that this, which is what you've achieved by your flower arrangement, complete simplicity, the day itself is simplified, and this presumably was the psychological and human purpose of making such a flower arrangement, though at this point I have to inject a remark which I think is of some importance. There was once a school, when I was young, called confessional poetry. The late Robert Law, and I must admit I would never give a dime for his poetry. It's not just that I disliked the man, he disliked me. I still couldn't see the point of his poetry. And he had many disciples, including the late Sylvia Plath, but that is another story, and Berriman and Jarrell and so on. What I objected to in the poetry, in confessional poetry, is that the poet was telling you his or her own clinical history. I think of Anne Sexton as, may God forgive me, because I liked her as a person, but a particular offender in this regard. What I disliked about it is that, in effect, they would be saying, more or less in the mode of Baudelaire, look, this is my heart stripped bare. And yet, by the time you reach the end of the poem, both the writer's understanding of herself and himself and your apprehension of the writer were far more blocked and opaque than they had been at the beginning. Now, Stevens is not at all a confessional poet. He is massively reticent. He will not strip his heart bare. But he is so profoundly subjective a poet, like Wordsworth before him. His subjectivity is so authentic and enormous that you can go down layer after layer into it. It's rather like Milton Satan, who is perhaps the greatest subjective poet in the language and who finally cries out in his despair, in every deep, a lower deep opens, which makes the hell I suffer seem a heaven. You keep going down and down into the self in Satan. So here in Stevens, he's trying not to tell you anything about him, but even if I had not known his daughter so well and learned a great deal about him and since read the biographies, even if I hadn't spent a lifetime reading and loving and trying to understand the poetry, I guess at one point, way back there, this is so far back, half a lifetime ago, around 1969 or 1970, I published some huge 500-page commentary, actually under the title of Wallace Stevens' The Poems of Our Climate. At least I think I did. When you start getting old and you've written too many books, it all starts getting a bit mixed up. But I think I did. Where was I? He doesn't want you to know much about him. But by the time you've really worked through even just the Poems of Our Climate, you know things about him that he doesn't know himself, at least doesn't want to know. And it's rather shattering knowledge. It is incredibly revelatory. I don't mean on, the foolish level of saying what one really longs for is the next man rather than the next woman. I don't mean that sort of thing at all. I mean about the kind of subjectivity one is, about the way in which one confronts oneself and the business of living. Say even that, look, even if this worked, my flower arrangement or my poetry or the way I've lived my, that this complete simplicity, stripped one of all one's torments, concealed, but let's not go further. What's weird about the way stripped and concealed are being used there on opposite ends of the same line? I talked about putting words in apposition when in fact they are in opposition. He would do it right through the rest of his poem, won't he? To strip is to take things off, as in a striptease say. To conceal is to put things on. Say even that this complete simplicity, and obviously one is shocked at that complete simplicity one has achieved, stripped one of all one's, and that's a very strong word, torments. It's hard to believe that that doesn't mean inner anguish, as well as perhaps unfulfilled sexual desire, stripped one of all one's torments, concealed, and then an astonishing line. Stevens would do almost anything to avoid introducing the capital letter I into his poetry. At least 400 times he substitutes one, O-N-E, for it. That makes, by the way, its occasional appearance, as in a great moment in Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, where he suddenly cries out, "What am I to believe?" There's something stunning and shattering about it. Not what is one to believe, but what am I to believe, for a poet who avoids that. So here, the evilly compounded vital I. Now that, of course, is one's own ego. But what's probable or improbable, or what is difficult about, he's again done it, he's put in opposition, he's put in apposition, forgive me, I'm getting a little tired, what is in fact opposed. Vital cannot be used, no matter how you want to use the word vital. You can use it descriptively, or you can use it eulogistically in praise of something. You cannot deprecate anything or anyone or any quality by calling it vital. It is a very positive term. It, after all, means life itself. If you speak of a woman's vitality or a man's vitality, the vitality of a friend, the vitality of a character in a work of fiction, you mean something very positive by it. If you speak of the vitality of James Joyce or the extraordinary vitality of Henry James or of Walt Whitman, one knows that one is commending them as well as describing them. But evilly compounded raises a problem because it seems to be going in the opposite direction from vital. And there's a strange trick here. The word evil, as Stevens notes, all through his own poetry as an esthétique du mal, he uses evil exactly the way Keats, who was a naturalistic humanist who had no Christian beliefs whatsoever, as Stevens was himself a naturalistic humanist with no Christian or theistic beliefs of any kind. Evil never means evil in terms of moral good or evil in either poet. Evil always means in Stevens what he learned from Keats. Evil is the necessary suffering that any natural woman or natural man suffers from having to live in a natural world with all its vicissitudes. So the evilly compounded vital I is even more a question of a strange dialectic of apposition and opposition, and made it fresh. Let's say I could go even further than the flower arrangement or the poem, etc., and made it fresh in a world of white. A world of clear water, brilliant edge, and now I think one sees the full force of the first line. What happens when you juxtapose that fifth line of the second section to the opening line of the poem? Clear water in a brilliant bowl, a world of clear water, brilliant edged. What does that interplay indicate? It's intricate, but it certainly is interpretable, isn't it? I don't say the poem is simple. I don't say it is easy. It is, however, I think, totally coherent. One could discuss it for 10 hours, though I might drive you mad. An hour and 50 minutes, will be quite enough for all of us, I'm quite sure. But you could discuss it for 10 or 12 or 15 hours if you read closely and kept your bearings about you. And you would illuminate it further, and it would illuminate you further. It is a totally achieved work of art. It's a stunning poem. It's a kind of lesson in what a poem really can be if written, by a masterful writer. But it demands exquisitely close reading. You need to struggle with it. So here, a world of clear water, brilliant edge. How does that play against that first line? Clear water in a brilliant bowl. Yes, dear?
The water is cloudy now in the center. It's
Yes, say it a little more loudly, dear. Even though I'm wearing my hearing aids, I'm getting to be a mechanical man. I have a pacemaker, I have hearing aids, and I suppose I should be wearing eyeglasses, but go on, dear.
The water is not as pure throughout as it was before. It's around the edges, it's still clear.
Okay, but isn't there something else which is involved? Look, you set out... I'm sorry, dear. Go on.
I think the surface is different from...
Yes. Yes, the surface change is important, but what you're going to say, dear?
It seems to affirm that the first line was an allegory for like a plane sublime or uncorrupted Platonic.
Okay, yes, and say more about that, because what you're saying is very good.
And it seems to relate to Keats, and this seems to be what Keats comes to.
These are the latest Danish model hearing aids, but your voice is soft and gentle, so for all of us, speak a little more louder.
This world of brilliant edged, clear pool of water seems to be the vision that Keats has at the end of his Passion Urn, and so this seems to connect to that.
All right, there is a linkage there, and what were you going to suggest, sir?
I'm at the start, it's a clear water in a bowl, so it's really contained. And by the end of this second stanza, the whole world is clear water, so it's been expanded.
Okay.
So some kind of achievement.
Yes, no, that is certainly relevant. Yes, sir.
It also renders the first mention of the bowl tormentless.
Yes.
Which seems to play against the bitterness of it
Yes.
subjectively.
Yes, and what kind of defeat is being acknowledged in that extraordinary, brilliant edge? Think of Shakespeare, as one always must think of Shakespeare finally, and all issues of art and nature. That wonderful dialogue in the Winter's Tale between Perdita and Polixenes, in which she says, I will not give you gillivores, they are nature's bastards, which reverberates ironically because she has been exposed and left for dead, though fortunately it didn't happen because she was supposed to be a bastard and wasn't. And he said, no, he says, the art itself is nature, meaning the art of the gardener in growing these. The art itself is nature, which does appear to be Shakespeare's own position. Polixenes does seem to be speaking for him, though it's always dangerous to say that anyone in any of the plays can speak for that mysterious personage, Shakespeare himself. But in that art-nature dichotomy, which obviously has to be involved in this poem, you have set up a heterocosm by your Japanese flower arrangement, by your poem, an alternate world to that of nature. And you produced for a while so vivid an effect that you seem to make nature into the art that you were practicing, a rather Oscar Wildean or Walter Paterian effect, I suppose. But now you discover, with I think some bitterness, that all that you've done, and this is very Keatsian, is that the two worlds of art and nature are still very far removed from one another, and the edge between them now has all the brilliance. It shines forth and tells you that the only work of your flower arrangement, your poem, your characteristic art, your mode of thought, the whole poetic tradition that you've inherited, is far from reconciling art and nature, or being able to say with Shakespeare's Polixenes, the art itself is nature, is to say that the whole work, this all has come to nothing because all you've done is make the border, the demarcation between the two more brilliant than either nature or art. And then you get the two lines that always fascinated me. My late friend, the great critic Kenneth Burke, with whom I once taught this poem in conjunction. It was in a seminar perhaps at Princeton one day 100 years ago. Kenneth has been dead for some time now, though he lived to a vast old age. I think Kenneth was about 97 when he died, but his last book, a very fine book called The Rhetoric of Religion, was actually written in his early 60s. After that, though he could still speak brilliantly, he had drunk too deep of the mystical waters. Too much gin and vodka had flowed, and he wasn't quite the same kind of a fellow. But I still remember reciting those lines aloud. Still, one would want more, one would need more, and that more clearly is a refrain. More than a world of white and snowy scents. And he said, Harold, he said, you speak English, and we all know this, because I did speak Yiddish as a child in the East Bronx and taught myself English. And my friend John Holland is always correcting my pronunciation quite rightly, because I learned it through the eye rather than through the ear. though born in this country. And George Bernard Shaw is right, that his tremendous crusade, which failed to do something about English orthography, the spelling of English and the pronunciation of English are further apart than perhaps any language that I even begin to know. In Kenneth's New Jersey ear, S-C-E-N-T-S sounded exactly like S-E-N-S-E. And when I protested to him that, so far as I knew, Stevens did not go in for homonyms or puns, he said, well, he did this time, Harold. It's just you can't hear it because of the way you pronounce S-C-E-N-T-S. And he may be right. If Kenneth was right about that, if that is a homonym or a pun, and in a sense he can't be wrong, because if you hear it, you hear it, still one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy scents. In a way, you are back in pink and white carnations. One desires so much more than that. You'd have to be a ghost not to want more, need more than a world of white and snowy scents. You couldn't be a living human being and be content just with that. And if indeed S-C-E-N-T-S also implies S-E-N-S-E, it would reinforce it. But I want to take our remaining time, first about a quarter of an hour or so on that extraordinary third section, and then 5 minutes to sort of look at it together as a unit. There won't be time for any questions today, but those of you who come back and will have read the Stevens that is there, we can get back to this, since it is one of the poems actually printed in the book. It sounds different, doesn't it? When I speak of a March metric, that's the way it echoes in my inner ear. And, John Hollander, who is a great authority on metrics, says, yes, that's roughly all right, Harold, but. Let's forget the but, since there isn't time. There would still remain the never-resting mind. I was discussing with a handsome lady today who had done me the honor of coming to lunch with me as she drove us back here. Actually, we were driving us there, never resting, saying that I had picked up from this, I picked up so much from Stevens, sooner or later, this is always the case, I will necessarily be writing recommendations for many people in this room. It is, on the one hand, my obligation, it's part of the profession. On the other hand, by the time you have taught, as I have now, for 50, this is the start of my 52nd or 53rd consecutive year of full-time teaching here, you go from one recommendation to the next. I also seem to go these days, sadly, from endorsing or blurbing one book to the next, so that at times I feel real madness will come down upon my head. But look, it has occurred to me for some time that if I were recommending one of you, and I wrote in the letter of recommendation, and in addition to all this, she has a restless mind, I wouldn't be doing you any good, would I? But if I said, and I sometimes do say this in praise of someone, she has a never-resting mind, one obviously means it as a eulogistic remark, a remark in praise, a strong commendation. So Stevens must mean it as something more than mere restlessness. There would still remain, in spite of all this, the never-resting mind. And there's that one again. So that one would want to escape, come back from that world of the flower formulation or the poem, come back to what had been so long composed. He had been reading, and this is extraneous because I think you could work it out of the poem anyway, he was fascinated by the late will to power aphorisms of Nietzsche. And one of them, Nietzsche says, the whole of what we have agreed to call the cosmos might be called simply a paradox. It might be called a permanent fiction upon which all of us have agreed. That is that what had been so long composed, the supposed reality we rely upon metaphysically. And then Stevens does something very strange. He liked to write proverbs, or as he called them, adagia, and he kept a notebook of them. And one day, going through the notebook, I found in it the prose sentence, "The imperfect is our paradise," written years before this poem. He simply plucks the prose sentence out of the adagia and inserts it in this final section as though it were verse, and it works. but it means something subtly different. If it's an adage, an aphorism, an apothegm, a proverb by itself, the imperfect is our paradise, that makes it sound what? Part of the never-resting mind, rather than just the restless mind. That is to say, we are always questing for something more. It sounds rather even like Robert Browning in his most strenuously, and I love Browning, optimistic mode, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? But put it in the poem like this, it becomes strangely dark and negative. It means our paradise, that park or garden that we long for, since that's what paradisos means, is in itself imperfect. And Stevens, who has a tremendous feeling for the heart of words and likes to use them in what Pater called their border meanings, their etymological meanings, he knew that imperfect is imperfectus, originally a word out of carpentering, out of an unfinished. To be imperfect is simply something the carpenter left unfinished. The imperfect is our paradise. Our paradise is itself unfinished work. And the extraordinary last three lines, which I've never been able to get most literary critics to agree with me, suddenly you get, and this, when Stevens is at his most bitter, he will sometimes let his language sound almost neo-academic. Note that in this bitterness, and there also he's using it etymologically. If you go to a dictionary, you'll find that bitterness goes back to a root meaning broken. So in this brokenness, delight, but there's that opposition thing again. Bitterness and delight have been put into apposition, even though they can't be in apposition. Note that in this bitterness, delight lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds, is the way the syntax goes. Then comes the line in between, because since the imperfect is so hot in us. And that's the third thing in this poem I've never been able to convey to a English class in England. That use of hot. It's very American, and it hasn't changed very much. This is actually very close to the current vernacular. He is hot. I mean, this sounds vulgar, but I can't help that. He is hot for her, or he has the hots for her, or the other way about. It is not, as the British would have wanted, there's that marvelous sequence, which in fact Stevens knew, though he's not alluding to it, the group of 16, or the 15-line, they're 15-line sonnets by George Meredith, the novelist and poet, late Victorian, another pre-Raphaelite, in fact, whose poetry meant something to Stevens. That's good poetry. It's about the breakup of his marriage. And in a crucial poem he writes, then each applied to each that fatal knife, deep questioning that leads to endless dole, D-O-L-E, sorrow. Ah, what a dusty answer gets the soul when hot for certainties in this our life. That's a thoroughly still British or English use of hot. But this is not hot, I'm sorry. Since the imperfect, the unfinished, the broken is so hot in us, note that in this bitterness, delight lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. Now, a lot is reverberating there. Flawed is a Keatsian word. And as in Keats, as in the Eve of St. Agnes, goes all the way back to medieval English, and it means windblown. A flaw was a wind. A flawed word is a windblown word. How do you read lies? I cannot read it as other than saying, tells us untruth, lies to us. People I've debated with this says, no, that's all wrong, Harold. He's saying delight consists in, inheres in, flawed words and stubborn sounds. I don't think you can have both meanings, because they totally contradict one another. Why is mine likelier, as it were? Not mine, but why is the reading that says that delight, art, a poem, a flower arrangement, has to tell us untruths, since the imperfect is so hot in us, since we are so hot for something which is not broken or unfinished? lies, tells us untruths in necessarily windblown words, flawed words, and stubborn sounds that we cannot make subtler. He is actually echoing one of his own poems, the idea of order at Key West, as you'll see reading it for next time, those of you who do, where quite extraordinarily he ends the poem by saying, "The maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of ourselves and of our origins, in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds." In this poem, the maker's rage has not succeeded, and he's writing 7 years later than in the idea of order at Key West, which is a poem really about the return to poetry after a long silence, which had gone all the way back to 1923. Why does it have to be, I think, tells us untruths? Yes, sir?
Well, it seems to me that Stevens is trying to put his own insecurity on a celestial scale, because by saying the imperfect is our paradise, it's not really our paradise because we can't escape it. It's just sort of our lot. And while the poem seems to be about revision, he can only find perfection in someone else's work and not in his own in the first place.
Without quarreling with you or deprecating what you've said, allow me to question your use of the word insecurity. I think the aesthetic dignity achieved by this poem does not allow you or me or any of us to speak of his insecurity. A man who has written this poem need not, in that dimension or realm, feel any insecurity whatsoever. I have never in my life written a poem or tried to write a poem because I suppose, aside from lacking the proper talents, I became so intoxicated with poetry when I was very, very young, so crowded everything out of my head as a reader, and it became for me forever a scary threshold, guarded by hungry demons who would eat me up if I tried to write a poem. But with a poet like Stevens, like Whitman, like Hart Crane, like Elizabeth Bishop, one wants to watch very carefully one's use of a term like insecurity. You don't mean insecurity anyway. Insecurity can be a psychological state or an ontological state, but that isn't what he's manifesting here.
Well, his never-resting mind.
All right. His mind is not appeased by what he has done. And he's been writing poetry for a long time. He's one of those remarkable American cases. All the great American poets, with the single exception of Hart Crane. Crane dies at 32. If Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost had died at 32, we wouldn't know who they are. Nothing of significance had been written by them as yet. Crane, who kills himself at 32, simply unfolded. His other poets had to undergo a very painful and long development. And Stevens was quite remarkable. He wrote poems when he was a Harvard undergraduate back in about 1899 and 1900. And he stopped completely, went to law school, got married, started again around late 1914, and in 1915 wrote what was to be his first famous poem, Sunday Morning, then wrote poems pretty steadily down to the publication of his extraordinary first book, Harmonium, in 1922. By 1923, as we'll see next time, he's hit a real poetic crisis. Not an insecurity, but a kind of real deep shock or horror at the dilemma of writing a poem. And there have been other major poets of the 20th century, of the greatest power like Paul Valéry, or before that von Hofmannsthal, or Georg Trakl, who've had similar crises and have simply stopped. Stevens did not stop, but he was a long time coming back. In 1931, he writes a poem called The Sun This March. It's his first poem written since, I believe, for 8 years. And he cries out towards the end of it, the light brings voices as of lions coming down, and he cries out in a kind of agony, meaning, as he says, by a rabbi, the scholar, the figure who understands, the wise person. Oh, Rabbi, Rabbi, fend, F-E-N-D, fend my soul for me, and true savant of this dark nature be, meaning I cannot act as my own savant. But he had to, of course, as any poet had to, and he works his way through different stages. The Poems of Our Climate, he's almost on the threshold of what will be his greatest phase. He will go on in 4 years to write Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction in 1942, and from then to his death in 1955, he goes from strength to strength. There is in this poem, perhaps not an insecurity, but there is a certain malaise. There is a certain sense that maybe you are paying too high a price, both imaginatively and humanly, in your work as a poet and in your life, by taking up the kind of minimalism that you have taken up, by so desperately trying to strip yourself of pathetic fallacies, by trying to learn to live with what Freud would call the reality principle alone. You cannot live with the reality principle. All the reality principle is, as Freud rather beautifully, if grimly, says, making friends with the necessity of dying. At the age of 20 or 21, one can always say, oh, all right, Uncle Siggy, I will make friends with the necessity of dying. At 76, one isn't quite, so free in agreeing with Dr. Freud, for whom I, of course, have almost the same reverence that I do for Stevens. Though I did manage to write my book on Stevens, and the one book that defeated me in this life. But we still have a few minutes today, so I'll allow one last personal reflection. Many years ago, I signed a contract for a vast book on Freud, which was to be called Transference and Authority. I would teach year-long graduate courses here on Freud, year after year, and started writing the book. But in my end was my beginning. It all fell apart on me. I found that I was so ambivalent about him and couldn't agree with myself for even a single page about him, that it just was not possible to go on. And I've never fully understood that. Perhaps only what they call the Sitra Akra, which I think might not be there when you get there on the other side, would one understand perhaps what was involved. Let's stand back from the poem together. We've been reading the poem as I think one should read, like this, with your nose pressed so hard against it. I jokingly said an hour and a half or an hour and 40 minutes ago that one is in danger of sort of pushing one's nose through to the other side of the page. But just as sometimes in a museum when you're fascinated by a painting, say an El Greco or a Vermeer or whatever, you don't want to, aside from the fact that the guard doesn't want you to get that close to it, since it isn't under glass or anything. But you don't want to just sort of admire its texture. You want to stand further and further back from it, because sometimes if you stand far enough back from it, it will look different. You'll achieve a different perspective. So let us stand back from this poem. We have been standing very close to it. We've read it, I think, about as closely as I know how to read a poem. And don't worry, those of you who choose to survive, we obviously will not have time to read every poem we're going to read quite as closely as we did that, though this has its usefulness, as I've discovered through the years, as a paradigm. Sometimes I vary the poem. I take Stevens as a postcard from the volcano, or I take Elizabeth Bishop's extraordinary early poem called The Unbeliever, which I could never persuade her to like, but I've always been fascinated by. In fact, recently when I've had trouble with climbing stairs and I get very scared of it, I wake up at night and find that I'm repeating the close of that poem. The Gaul inquired into his dream, which was, I must not fall. The spangled sea below wants us to fall. It is hard as diamonds. It wants to destroy us all. That universal deep horror of falling afflicts me these days. But at this point, obviously, I'm not teaching anymore. I'm just in my exhaustion making a personal confession. Let's take one more minute, and then we can all be liberated. You from me, and I momentarily from myself. If you stand back from this poem, what you feel is, on the one hand, its achievement, and on the other, and one says this very gingerly because, there are not many poems in any century as magnificently and fully achieved as this is, and yet still Stevens himself is clearly very unhappy with it. In fact, the poem says it's very unhappy with itself at the close. If lies indeed does mean, tells us untruths in flawed words and stubborn sounds. What kind of achievement is it? What makes it memorable? And certainly I find it shockingly memorable. And a kind of warning always to myself. Not that I have a Stevens-like personality, obviously. He was known for his silences. And my wife daily, as I leave the house, says, "Become Harold the listener." And I say, well, how about Harold the silent, on the model of that unfortunate Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready, who was not ready when William the Conqueror landed. What does it achieve? Those of you who like it, and some of you must like it in spite of me, I would not want you to like it because of me. What does one like about it? Obviously, it has astonishing integrity. Obviously, it is fully made, as I say, though it would drive us all mad, and they would have to carry me out anyway. One could go on for 4 or 5 more hours with it, and more could be uncovered that is worth uncovering. It's profoundly, the German phrase for music that is fully composed, durchkomponiert, written through. This poem is written through. It's absolutely written through. You feel he's done as much with it as a poem can do when it accepts the limitations that this deliberately imposes upon itself. But the limitations make him, perhaps that's what gives you the impression of insecurity, whether psychological or ontological. The limitations make him unhappy. That refrain that beats through the poem of more, 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 he must have remembered because he had read Blake, though he didn't like to admit it. A very great proverb of hell in Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which has haunted me all my life. Time is up.
The lecture was from the first session of Professor Bloom's course, The Art of Reading a Poem, on September 7th, 2006.